Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman. I'm with IIST and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, A Disciplined Agile Test Design Process by Dr. Magdi Hanna. We are excited that you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of webinars to introduce the topics as well as presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Leading an Effective Test Organization with a High-Performance Test Team by Tom Staub on March 20th from 1 to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to www.qualitymanagementconference.com. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdi Hanna.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks everyone again for joining us today in this 1-hour webinar. As Eric said, I will try everything I can to give you as much information as possible in this webinar, but remember that the full details of the webinar or that subject is really in this, is during the conference. Just in case in the beginning, if you'd like to know why you should spend the next hour listening to me, some of you might have already listened to me in the past, but if you have not, here's just a brief introduction about myself. Been around for a long time, started my professional life back in 1975 as a developer, and I've been doing a number of jobs around the United States after I moved here to the States in 1981. Have actually worked on all levels of jobs and projects, from developer to development lead to QA analyst to QA manager to project manager. You can imagine over the 35 years I've done quite a bit. I am the CEO and founder of the International Institute for Software Testing. I'm also the founder of Romana Software. It's a company that has an ALM product. With that being said, let's get started with the webinar. Here's a quick view of my agenda and what I hope to cover today. Again, as I said, this is actually the same agenda that I cover in the full day, but of course I will not be able to spend the same amount of time in each one of those bullets. So we're gonna touch on as much details as possible. We're gonna spend a few minutes in the beginning here talking about characterizing Agile projects in general. I'm sure if you have been involved in an Agile project, you already know what Agile means, so I'm not gonna spend much time with that. We need to visit the area of what are the goals of Agile testing when we are on an Agile project, what are we trying to achieve? Which shouldn't be much different really from what we're trying to achieve in a non-Agile projects. And very quick after that, I'll present to you my own test, Agile test life cycle, including the planning phase, the design phase, and the execution phase. As part of the planning phase, I'd like to also present it to you what I've been doing as far as Agile risk analysis, because risk analysis becomes very critical in Agile projects since we don't have much time to do all the kind of things we want to do, right? With that being said, if we look at characterizing Agile projects, you can imagine many of these already know that. All Agile projects are fast-paced. We need to finish as much as possible within a very short time frame. Now, you can also understand that some of the non-Agile projects are also becoming fast-paced. So fast-paced is the characteristic of almost any project we work on nowadays. As you probably know also, Agile projects are highly incremental and highly iterative. Let me just take a minute here to distinguish between the two and to tell you the difference, because I've seen many people confusing the two. Incremental means that we're not going to implement a large set of functionalities all at once, but rather we are going to break the functionality that we are supposed to present to our customers into segments, into increments, or into sprints. Each sprint or each increment would have a number of features that we focus on. Now, of course, the length of the sprint, as you know, is different from one project to another. Some people say it needs to be 2 weeks. Some people do it at 3 weeks. Some people do 4 weeks. In fact, I don't believe that the Agile framework has defined the length of an increment or a sprint. I do Agile projects. Some of my Agile projects are 1-day increments, and some other Agile projects are 3-month increments. And this is the flexibility of Agile. Now, iterative is different in the sense that we're not sure exactly if we understand everything about the requirement upfront. We're not sure that we captured everything that the customer wanted. So as a result, we're going to follow an iterative approach, meaning that we're going to build something that we believe would meet the customer needs. And we will present it to the customer in a session that's sort of a prototyping session or a show and tell session, whatever you want to call it. And we receive feedback from the customer, and based on the feedback, we go back and revise what we have done, go back one more time, present it to the conference, and go back and forth, back and forth. Now, you probably need to know that the iterative approach of Agile development is not something new to the Agile framework, but this is the same thing that that James Martin from the UK back in 1989 and 1999, 1988, 1989, late 80s, I should say, has called it RAD, Rapid Application Development. So rapid application development, which we've known since the late 80s, have gotten a little bit fancier name called, iterative development. All right. Now, it is true that almost all Agile projects the requirements are less formal and less complete. Let's face it. Every once in a while, I see an Agile project that spends a bit more time in requirements, but if we are going to use the concept of user stories, we all know that user stories are brief, much more brief than writing a requirement. Now, that's not to generalize, because many Agile projects also use normal requirements as we've known them for a long time. I've seen Agile projects also using use cases, which we're going to kind of talk about them briefly in this presentation. And the use cases, as you probably know, are very detailed. But the majority of Agile projects have much less formal requirements, much less complete requirement documents. We need to be aware of that. Now, something important about Agile, you probably already, if you've been in Agile project already, you probably know that. It's more talking and communicating than documenting, all right? So we don't like to document so much, because the Agile Manifesto clearly said it. The Agile Manifesto said, we value working systems over comprehensive documentation. So with that being said, people start focusing so much on working together. And again, that's important. And that's why at IIST, while we were developing the body of knowledge of the Agile testing certification, it was very crucial that the advisory board made sure to include an area of the body of knowledge called collaboration and teamwork. As QA individual, as a QA professionals, if we're not very good at collaboration and communication, we cannot succeed in Agile projects. So these are the general characteristics of Agile projects. You may have other things that you have experienced in your Agile projects. Please feel free to share those with me through the questions panel. Now, what are we trying to achieve when we test in Agile projects? Well, some people say, I want to test as much of the requirements as possible. Or if you're using user stories, then we want to cover or want to test as much of the user stories as possible. We refer to this as requirement coverage, or if you want to call it user story coverage, that's fine. It's making sure that we have tested everything, or as much as possible, of what the customer wanted. Some other people take a different approach and say, I want to test as much of the code as possible. I want to share this with you because as QA professionals, and actually, if you have been listening to me in other presentations, other courses, you would know that I cannot do a course without speaking about code coverage, because code coverage becomes, in my opinion, even far more important than requirement coverage. I wanted to bring this up to you because, at least in my experience throughout the years, I found out that we could spend as much time as possible trying to cover as much of the requirements or user stories as possible. But guess what? There is always a gap. There is always a gap between what we see in the requirements and what we see in the user stories and what developers actually have put in the code. And because of that gap, very often we put out releases where we have not tested everything in the code. And you can imagine if one line of code or one block of code has not been tested, and it goes out in the field and it gets exposed in the field, and we have not tested it, we really can't tell what's going to happen. So I wanted, just in that one single bullet, please, I put it there intentionally to raise your awareness about code coverage. Some of you might already be aware of code coverage, but again, most QA and testing professionals do not think of code coverage. Please, whether you are in an Agile project or a non-Agile projects, please understand that it is not enough to only cover or test as much of the requirements as possible, but rather test as much of the code as possible as well. Now, some other people say, oh, what I want to do is to find as many problems as possible. I refer to this as a desperate approach. You do this only when you're very desperate, when you're given 1 or 2 days and you want to test. And you don't have time to look at the requirements or the user stories and the details and find out, if the system does what's supposed to do or not. And some people take the third approach. Let me tell you that, really, in my opinion, your goals and your objectives when you're testing in an Agile project must be a combination of all these three. I don't know what you had in mind, but please, if you have something else different in mind, share it with me, and so that I can share it with everyone else. But again, based on my experience in an Agile and non-Agile project, you should be focusing on these three things. All right, and you should try to balance them as much as possible. Now, of course, this is not the webinar or the presentation where I get into details of how to balance all these three. I do this in many other webinars, and I get into a lot of details about how to do testing based on requirements, as well as testing based on the code without even looking at the code, because most QA professionals will say, I don't know anything about the code, I don't read the code, I don't even understand the programming language. And the trick is that you do not have to, yet you can achieve higher level of code coverage. With that, I want to present to you here the very, very simple Agile testing lifecycle. As you can see, the phases within the life cycle are not much different from the phases of any testing life cycle. Agile is not going to cut down on any one of those. However, Agile will have to do each one of those differently. So as you can see here, we have Agile test planning, Agile test design, Agile test execution, and even Agile bug reporting. The two differences between this life cycle and a traditional non-Agile life cycle is in two things. One is that each one of those is going to be done very differently. If you have been involved in a lot of non-Agile traditional waterfall projects, you'll see the difference. You'll see, for example, that in test planning, we write a document, we refer to it as a test plan. It might be 30 or 40 pages that includes items such as the scope of the testing project, the requirements that we need to test, all that stuff. Again, we're going to do the same, but on a much, much lower scale, as you're going to see in a little bit. The same happens with system design. Now, so that's one difference, is that each one of the phases will be done very different. In fact, let me tell you this. In an Agile project, you can take one user story and follow this life cycle or process you're looking at in 1 hour. In 1 hour, you would be planning for the user story, you would be designing the tests for the user story, you will be executing tests, you will be writing the bug report. Again, depending, of course, on the size of the user story, okay, you could do this in 1 hour, and you could possibly finish all testing of one user story in 1 hour. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is the second difference. It is the iterative and feedback nature of this process. As you can see, every box feeds back to every other box. Okay, absolutely. Which means what? You could be sitting here executing some tests in an Agile project, and you realize that there are certain things you wanted to test, but they have not been designed, and they have not been planned. Depending on that thing you want to test on the fly, I suggest that you go back to the test design quick in about 10 minutes, 7 minutes, and start designing. And of course, what I'm saying here may not make much sense to you because you still do not know what it means to design, to do Agile test design or do Agile test planning. But all what I'm saying now, you could go and design the test for that thing you wanted to test. And you do this in about 7 to 10 minutes. And you go and run the tests. Now, in some cases, you might find out that what you really wanted to test, which has not been documented here, is not as simple as just going back here, but rather you need to go back all the way to the planning to do some planning activities there. And when you do some planning activities, you come back and you do some design activities, and you start testing. Again, the 7 minutes now become maybe 15 minutes. Now, keep in mind, the more you iterate through this process, the more time you spend. So initially I said you could finish the testing of one user story in 1 hour. But if you have not done, let me tell you that much, if you have not done careful test planning and the careful test design here, and maybe and you started discovering more stuff here and even there, because as you're writing a bug report for one problem you encountered, guess what? You might get an idea that there is something else that might even be a problem. And you could do one of three things. You could go back and run the test on the fly. I mean the other test. And if it works fine, then that's okay. If it doesn't work fine, then you include it in the bug report, or you write a different bug report. Or a second thing you might do, and instead of just going back to execute, you can go back to the test design. And you say, okay, I discovered something that possibly would not work. Or possibly, I mean, we have not tested it, so we don't know. So you go back and do the design work, and you come back and run the test. And if it works, that's fine. If not, then you write a bug report. Or the third thing I was referring to is that you might go all the way. So as you can see, you can go all the way from anywhere to anywhere. That's really the nature. I mean, when you do testing in Agile, you've got to do that. You've got to be prepared to do that. Otherwise, you're not doing Agile testing. Now, of course, please, if you have any question as I speak, feel free to write your questions in the questions by clicking the question panel, and I will peek into the questions as we go. I'll just open the questions panel in front of me quick so that I make sure I am addressing your questions as they go. Okay. Now, probably you are curious now to know what each one of those boxes means, right? Again, if you understand test planning in a non-Agile project, you should be able to relate some of those topics or activities into what you already know. Essential thing about test planning in Agile, in fact, again, I will keep saying, it's the same thing about Agile, non-Agile. So, but of course, what features will we test? We think about this differently in an Agile project. So this question means, in an Agile project, means that what user stories are we supposed to test? All right. Now, let me just leave it at that. I'll get into more details in a little bit. So to start the test planning, you can understand that there is no way to continue any further before you can understand what features you are going to be testing, what user stories. If you're using requirements, so what requirements are we testing? All right. Now, important to know what dependencies between those, because some features or some user stories need to be tested together. Some user stories must be tested before other user stories. Okay? Whatever dependencies exist between the features or the user stories, you must understand those. Now, this is simple stuff, by the way. Now, if you're thinking that in an Agile project, we're not going to have time to do test planning, well, guess what? In a given sprint or iteration, I do this test planning in about 1 hour. 1 hour, that's all what I want. And I'm going to write a small document. I'm not going to write that test plan that consists of 20 or 30 pages anymore. I'm going to write probably 1 page, 2 pages at most. 2 pages that describes what I have in this slide. Okay? To what extent will we test each feature? And that's an important one. That's really the backbone of the Agile test planning. To what extent? Some people read this and says, what do you mean to what extent? To the greatest extent, to as much as we can. Not really, because we're going to find out that we cannot test everything in an Agile project. In order to understand to what extent will we test each feature or each user story, we got to take the user story or the feature and break it down into scenarios. So to me, scenarios are in the heart of the Agile test planning process. Again, I do not know how to plan for my tests in an Agile project without taking a user story or a feature or requirement and then break it down into scenarios. I'm going to tell you what a scenario is very briefly. Scenario is not a fancy thing. It's a very simple concept. A scenario is one sentence that describes a situation or a condition that could possibly happen in production. Now, again, if you have heard me talking in other webinars, other courses, you're going to always hear me talking scenarios. If you're willing to believe my experience, please understand that without thinking scenarios, we cannot do good testing. Of course, I cover scenarios in much more details in a 3-day course called Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design. And it's a workshop kind of a course that I do. But you still can understand scenarios. I mean, if you've been around for a while, you understand what scenarios are, then you could, all what I'm suggesting here is in an Agile project is to take a feature, break it down into scenarios, because we are going to do our test planning based on those scenarios. Okay? Because in fact, I'm going to show you a risk-based model by which you could reduce the number of scenarios you're going to be testing. Now, aside from scenarios and what scenarios you're going to be testing, then you need really to think about what environment will we be testing for. When I say environment here, I'm talking about the test environment that has to mimic the production environment. Right? In the simplest case, am I going to be testing for Firefox and Internet Explorer or only Firefox? And if I'm going to do Internet Explorer, am I going to be testing for IE11, IE10, IE9, whatever? That's in the simplest form of the concept of environment. But you can imagine, you need to take the time to think about the production environment where that system is going to work. And you have to list those environments. Now, this bullet here, again, exists in non-Agile test planning. But the only difference is that we probably have a section of the test plan that's about 2 or 3 pages that describes just the environment. We're not going to do that. We're going to simply list the environment. And this is the last bullet here, is a critical thing about test planning. And let me say, if you do not do it in test planning, you're going to have to do it in the very next phase, which is test design. Okay? And that is, how do you expect the system to handle each one of the scenarios? You came up with the scenarios, but it doesn't help just say, okay, here are the scenarios we're going to test, because you need to understand, how do you expect the system to handle each one of those? Now, in some cases we know, in some cases we don't know. And those cases where when we don't know what to expect, those are the cases I want you to spend some time with, because that means that you have to go back to the product owner, you have to go back to the business analyst if you have one in an Agile project. We don't have too many of those in Agile projects anymore. And consult with them, communicate and collaborate, and try to say, okay, in this scenario here, how do we expect the system to handle this? Are we expecting the system to do this or this or this or that? And I suggest you do this in the planning phase, because once you get to the next step, which is the Agile test design, in many cases it will be too late, right? Those are, to me, the main activities in Agile test planning. Now let's look at the whole test planning and design process. The first thing you notice in this chart, if you can see, that I have two different shades of colors. I have the dark shades of colors on the right. I have the lighter shades of colors on the center and left. Let me tell you that I just am using the darker shade to indicate a more formal process. Okay? A less formal process is on the left and center. Because in an Agile project, we have to be flexible. In some Agile projects, we're going to be a bit more formal than others. And even perhaps within the same Agile project, sometimes we're going to be more formal than some other times within the same project. In fact, I may have some user stories, meaning less formal. So of course, some of you say, really, are you considering user stories to be less formal? Absolutely. They are the least formal form of requirements. Because if you have not seen user stories before, a user story looks like this. Here's an example of a user story. For example, as a customer, I would like to be able to place orders online and pay by credit card. That's the user story. You can imagine how brief that is. All right? Requirements are typically far more detailed than user stories. User interface, which is the screen prototypes, the screen designs, has much more details than the user story. That's why sometimes we start with a user story and we'll start building some screens, and the screens will provide or will supplement the user stories. And sometimes we even have requirements which are supposed to be more formal, and then we take the requirement and start building some user interface. I shouldn't say we start, I should say the development team starts, assuming I'm speaking about myself as a QA person. So if the development team has built the user interface, then we can certainly use that user interface as a starting point. Sometimes we go to the right, to the extreme, and use use cases. And that's the extreme formal case. Now, as I said earlier, some projects do use use cases. All right? I've seen them a lot. And when you use use cases, you derive use cases from requirements, because in that scenario here, or that situation, requirements will be much more brief than use cases. In use cases, you have much more details. Let me tell you, whether you do user stories or user interface or requirements, I want you to come here to this. I mean, I know it's trivial to put a big box and I call it questions. There has to be a time for the Agile team to look at any one of those things and ask questions. And let me tell you that those questions and the answers to those questions must always be documented. And now I know when I started talking about documentation, I'm making some Agile people unhappy, because again, we value working systems over comprehensive documentation. Let me tell you this, without documenting the questions being asked and the answers given, without documenting those, we're really playing in the dark. We're working in the dark. Because 6 months from now, 1 year from now, someone is going to come and question some decision that was made. And the answer is going to be in this documentation. Now, having said that, I'm not suggesting that we create a document called the questions and the answers, for example. No. I have another 1-hour webinar on what I call collaborative requirement and scenario reviews. And that presentation or that material tells you how to do this collaboratively, online. Everything has to be online because the Agile team does not have time to meet. I'm not suggesting that we sit down in a room and try to ask questions. No. I'm going to suggest that we do this online using some sort of a work group support tool, whatever it is. For the projects I'm involved in, given that my development team and my test team are scattered all over the globe, I have people in India and Mexico, I have people in Pakistan. Of course, you can imagine it's not practical to even think of a meeting. So everything happens online. And I use a tool called Romana ALM to do that. You could use any tool you wish. You can get one free tool from the internet, but really everything has to be done. I'm sorry that I'm elaborating a little bit on something here that's within the Agile process. Now, I want you to see that the outcome of the Agile test planning is scenarios. I will consider myself done with Agile test planning if I came up with enough scenarios for every user story that I have, or for every requirement that I have, and for every screen that I have, and or for every use case that we have. The only difference here, within use cases, I'm going to refer to them as use case scenarios, which are different from those scenarios. And you may question, what is the difference between a use case scenario and just a scenario? There's no difference. Conceptually, there's no difference. The only difference is in the level of details. This scenario is going to be a sentence that says, for example, someone placing an order for something that's available in inventory. Or someone is registering for a course that he registered for one time before. Or someone is registering for a course while the course is closed. Or someone is trying to register for a course that is in the past. These are examples of scenarios. Now, when it comes to use case scenarios, if you've worked with use cases before, you know there are 4 more details than that. I don't think I want to get into the details of how use cases look like, because they contain things like the preconditions, the post-conditions, and the steps. So to close this discussion about test planning, and I'm looking at my time here, I only have about, I used half of my time already in test planning. This is not bad. We're okay. So the outcome of your Agile test planning is a set of scenarios. For each scenario, you have determined what the expected behavior is. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. We have determined what to expect, or how do we expect the system to handle each one of those scenarios. All right? So once you have the set of scenarios, then we're going to go to the next step. Before we go to test design, I'm going to go to the risk analysis. Why? Because let me tell you this, if you follow the process of scenarios and finding the scenarios and asking the questions, the more questions you ask, the more scenarios you're going to produce. If you follow use cases, you will always come up with much more scenarios than what you can ever test. It would be really actually a wonderful problem to have, that you have much more scenarios than what you can ever test. That means that you really explored all the possibilities that could possibly happen in production. And now you are at a point to say, okay, to what depth, to what extent am I going to test each one of the user stories or the features? And that simply says, which scenarios am I going to be really testing? Because guess what? I do not want to move to the next level to start designing tests while I have scenarios that I have already decided I'm not going to test. So the next thing here is the risk analysis. Let me just, this slide tells you that how do you start your test planning? You start with user interface if it is available. You have a feature list. that has been provided to you, or a list of user stories. You can create your own feature list and run it by your product owner. This is because you're trying to understand what are we going to be testing, what user stories, what features. Then you start creating scenarios for each feature, and now we're going to start assessing the testing priority for each scenario. And here are the 3 factors I'm going to be using. In my own experience and my own process, I do the risk-based testing on the scenario level, not on the requirement level, as some people suggest, and not on the test case level, as some other people suggest. And the reason is that on the requirement level, it's still too early. On the test case level, it's still a bit late. It's late because after I already designed my test cases, it doesn't help anymore to do risk analysis, because I already sort of wasted time to build test cases for things that I may decide later on that I am not going to test. So I do not want you, so please understand this process here. I don't want you to go down to design tests, whether they are exploratory tests or formal tests, before doing your risk analysis. Let me now show you how you do your risk analysis. You list all your scenarios for a given user story. So you're doing this for every user story or a feature or a requirement, whatever it is. And you're talking about these 3 factors. These 3 factors, 2 of them at least have been used by other people, but they have been misunderstood. This is the impact of failure, saying that if that scenario number 2 were to fail in production, what's the impact? And you can use a simple scale such as high, medium, and low. Okay? So, and you can define what high means to your own application. For some systems, high impact means some people are going to lose their lives, for example, God forbid. But guess what? In other systems, high impact could very well mean that the company is going to lose some money. So it depends on the kind of systems. I cannot tell you what a high and what medium, what low is. Frequency is a very common thing. It says, okay, how often do we expect this scenario to happen in production? Now, please understand, there is a misconception. Some people think that, how often do we think it's going to fail? No, we're not talking about how often it's going to fail. Because if it fails, it's going to fail. If it fails once, it fails every single time it runs. So I've heard this more than once. It's how often do we think this scenario will be exposed in production. Now, the last one, to me, is a very critical parameter to determining risk analysis. And that is the probability of failure. What is the likelihood for this scenario to fail in production? Some people, of course, say, well, I don't know. I need to run it first to see if it's going to fail or not. That's not the point. The point is you want to decide if it is likely to fail or not, because if it is likely to fail, then you must test it. If it is likely to pass, why should you waste your time testing it? That's very interesting here, because actually we only test the things we think is going to fail. If all your testing is focusing on the things that are passing, then you're wasting time. Then your testing is not effective. So really, you want to put your hand on the things that are most likely to fail. And just to give you a hint, because I don't have the time in this 1 hour to explain the whole model. This whole model, I teach it in my full day on the course called Designing and Executing Tests in Agile Project. I also cover it in my other courses. But let me give you a brief thing about how do you determine if a scenario is likely to fail or not. If that scenario you're looking at is not explicitly stated in the requirement, you can bet that the development team did not do anything about it. And as a result, 100% it is going to fail. So this is really where you start. Now, if you're dealing with user stories, let me tell you this. Almost all scenarios you work with are not in the user story. Sure. Then as a result, the probability of failure of every single scenario is high. That is why forgive me to say this, I don't like user stories. I don't like them. I wish, with all the wonderful things about the Agile framework, I don't know why Scrum came with the user stories. I mean, it just screwed up the whole requirement management field. Every time I read a book or an article about user stories to see if there is any new philosophy about user stories, I get frustrated. Why? Because you read people saying, oh, a user story should not include any details. Really? Should not include any details? So where are we going to find the details? And they tell you, yes, here is where you're going to find the details. In the discussion between you and the developer. Does this make sense? In the discussion? And what if I don't document those discussions, which are normally not documented? What if I get a tester a month from now who has not attended that discussion? So anyway, I'm not going to spend the time here criticizing user stories, but let me tell you this. We have a higher level of risk in Agile testing because a lot of the scenarios we're testing do not exist in the user stories. Allow me please to move on. So anyway, very quick here, I want to finish this slide. So once you do that, you start calculating a value here, and that value is simply calculated as an average of all three. If you consider high to be 3, and low means 1, and medium means 2, so 3 plus 1 plus 2, that's 6, divided by 3 is 2.0. 2 plus 1 plus 1, that's 4, divided by 3 is 1.33. Now I'm coming up with a number that I'm going to refer to this as the testing priority. Testing priority. Okay? And if I do this in a spreadsheet, I can sort the spreadsheet based on that testing priority, and I can get all the ones. So the number you're going to get here is anywhere from 1.0 to 3.0. And now if you have a limited amount of time, and you have, for example, for a given user story, you have 30 or 35 scenarios. You say, okay, I'm going to start with the scenarios that are, say, 2.0 and above testing priority. And you count how many scenarios. Maybe you find 15 or 20 scenarios out of the 35. So what do you say? You say, I'm going to start with those 20 scenarios that are 2.0 and above. And those are the only scenarios that I'm going to take to the next level, which is what? Which is test design. So you move to test design only with the scenarios that you decided you're going to test. We're going to talk in a little bit about what you do with the scenarios that you decided you're not going to test. So what's Agile test design? Now you take, so you're working on one user story, and you have 35 scenarios for a user story. You picked up 20 out of those. You decided you're going to test 20 scenarios. Then what do? For each one of the 20 scenarios, you do the following. You start to thinking about what input am I am going to use to test that scenario. And when you think about input, you think about valid input and invalid input, because I'm sure you know that valid input will be used for positive testing and the invalid input will be used for negative testing. Now, keep in mind, every time you think about a different input to use, you're thinking about a different test case. So every input, valid or invalid, is a different test case. So in a way, this first bullet says, think about your test cases based on valid and invalid input. But that is not the only source of building your test cases. Another source here is that what preconditions do we assume? You know, I refer to this as a system state, i.e., it's the state where the system is. Let me give you an example of this, because that's not clear to some people. Because to me, a test consists of input and the preconditions. Input and the preconditions. And based on the input and the preconditions, we decide on what output do we expect down here. So if I am testing a scenario where someone is trying to register for a course that he or she has already registered for that course before. That's the scenario I'm trying to register for, to test for. So I say, okay, I'm going to use a valid course number, but I am going to choose a course that has already been closed. I'm going to choose a valid course number that happened to be an online course. I'm going to choose a valid course number that happens to be a public course. I'm going to choose a valid course number that represents a one-day course. Each one of those is test cases. Okay, so that's the input. Now the preconditions are things like, I'm gonna set up a precondition that says this course has been closed, or this course is still available, or this course the person has signed up for it or not. So preconditions, and you can understand those more if you listen to some of my webinars on formal test design, because the preconditions here are not different from what we think about in formal test design. When we think about test cases, we always have to think about preconditions. Preconditions are assumptions, are things we expect to exist before I run the test. Okay, so you think about the preconditions. Now, of course, what should I expect for each one of the input that I decided to use and for each one of the preconditions? Any combination of input and the preconditions would have some expected results. Okay, so I need to understand my expected results. Remember, this is slightly different from what we decided on during the planning phase when we said, how do we expect the system to handle that scenario? So there are expected behavior of a scenario, but there are expected results of every test we do in the test design. Most importantly, if it is not obvious where to look for what I expect, I should really think about that. So for example, some people say, well, I expect that the credit card has been charged the correct amount. Sure. If the registration for a course is successful, then you say, I expect the credit card to be charged the correct amount. That's what you think here. Now here you come and say, okay, and where am I going to look for that? How am I going to verify that the credit card has actually been charged the correct amount? And this is very important. Because if I don't know that, I mean, if I know what to look for, but I don't know where to look for it, it doesn't help. Then I am not going to look for it. And guess what? This last bullet may mean that I'm going to have to interrogate the database. So I need to know what specific table within the database do I need to write a SQL query against to find out if the correct record has been stored or not. In some other simpler cases, I don't need to look at the database. I don't need to write a SQL query. I can just look at one or two of the screens. But in traditional testing, the last bullet here, or the last two bullets, are what we refer to in traditional non-agile testing as what? Verifying the results. If you have written test cases before and you always had to worry about verifying results, those are the last two bullets. All right. I'm back to the same chart again, but now to show you what's below this dashed line. We finished talking about test planning on the upper half of the chart here. Now I am taking one scenario at a time, whether it is a scenario that I produced from any one of those or a scenario that I produced from use cases. If I used any one of those, I suggest that you take a scenario and do one of two things. If you have the time and your project is a bit more formal, then you start writing formal test cases. And I'll show you in a little bit what a formal test case means. This is not any different from from your test cases you write in a non-agile project. Absolutely not. Okay, so in many cases, you're going to find that the testing artifacts are not much different. However, In most Agile projects, I suggest that you don't go that route because that takes a lot of time. But everything has advantages and disadvantages. Now, going a little bit exploratory. Now, there is a misconception out there. People think that exploratory testing means that I just sit down and test. I just try things. No, no. We're not going to sit down and just try things. We already came up with scenarios. We're going to start doing exploratory test design. Meaning what? I'm going to sit down and write an exploratory test case. It's a little bit brief than a formal test case, but I have to document it before I sit down and try to test. I can just go take that exploratory test and run it without anything. And that would be under test execution. I don't have it in this picture because this picture is only about test planning, test design. Or I could write a manual script for that exploratory test. I'll show you what exploratory test is in a little bit. And I write the manual script only when I have a boss that says, you got to write down the steps you're going to follow to test. But in many cases in an Agile project, I don't have time to write that manual script. In many cases, depending on how formal the project is, I take a group of exploratory tests and put them together as one set. So instead of writing one manual script for every exploratory test I want to run, I write a manual script for a group of test cases together. And the purpose of that is to minimize the number of scripts I write. But I want you to know that writing scripts in general, whether it is for each exploratory test or for each set of exploratory tests, happens only in certain situations. Now, I would not be surprised if an Agile project says, let's not write scripts because I have good testers who know how to test. Let's make sure that we come up with the scenarios and come up with the exploratory tests and run them. So I'm going to show you how to do this in a little bit. I know I have about 7 minutes left. All right. Now, as I said, if your project is a bit formal and you really can afford the time, you can write formal test cases. And you can take a group of test cases together, cluster them or group them into one set of formal test cases. And then you can write either manual scripts or automated scripts. So let me give you my own opinion now, whether you like it or not. I would go only that route if I'm doing automated testing. There is no, as you can see, this line going from here to here. If I am going this route here, if I'm going to write formal test cases, and I'm going to cluster all those test cases, not all of them, I'm going to cluster those test cases into groups or sets. I'm going to do this only if I'm going to write automated scripts. If I am not going to do automated testing, which of course would be insane in an Agile project. See the problem with Agile, it gave us a lot of flexibility, but sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot because of that. Excuse me. See, in one side we say in Agile projects we don't have enough time to do a lot of things. And we come back and say in Agile projects we must do test automation. Well, of course, we do test automation because we didn't have enough time to do a lot of manual testing. But test automation does not come for free. Test automation comes with a lot of work. You have to design your test cases. You have to cluster your test cases into sets. You have to write an automation engineer needs to take those test cases and write the automated scripts. Now, let me tell you this, just to give you some idea about what actually happens in Agile projects, which I've seen. I've seen people going from here, from user stories. Look at where I'm going to go now, all the way to here. Boom. That is ridiculous. to get an automation engineer to take a user story and say, now let's write the automated tests, you're setting up yourself for big failure. Write automated scripts for what? What do you know about what you need to test? I get surprised how people even think of testing without even going through that step. Everything has to have a process, guys. Agile does not mean sloppy. Agile does not have to be sloppy. We need to do things fast, that's true. But we need to follow a process, but that process needs to be simple and sweet and quick. I told you already, I can take you one user story, come up with scenarios in about 20 minutes. I can decide on, I can take about 35 scenarios, reduce them to 15 scenarios. Here is one thing I'm going to tell you interesting. All right, some people say, well, we must do test automation, but we don't have time to go through all the scenarios. So we took about 20 scenarios. We decided to go that route. We write formal test cases for 20 scenarios. We go and cluster some of the test cases together. We write automated test scripts. Now I have another 15 scenarios that I had already decided here that I am not going to test. Guess what? I'm going to say, take those 15 scenarios and do them exploratory. Simply design some test cases, some exploratory test cases for those 15 scenarios. Now you can see within the same project, I went to the right to a little bit more formal practice for some of the scenarios, and I went to the left for less formal scenarios in the same project. All right. I'm going to get to my next slide here because I don't have much time left. So what's an exploratory test? What does it look like? I know there are people out there, you know, James Buck, Kim Kainer, they're all wonderful people who have spoken about exploratory tests. Oh, that's my version of exploratory tests. Exploratory does not mean sloppy either, okay? Does not have to be sloppy. So for every exploratory test, this is much less formal than a formal test. I have a test case number. I'm not going to have exploratory test without a number, because otherwise how am I going to refer back to them? I need to have a title of what I'm going to test. These are two required, and the rest of the components are optional. I can have a description, which is simply, I can have a description, which is one sentence, one paragraph, or not. If I think that the title is not descriptive enough, then I need to provide description. I need to know what the expected results are, and I say they are optional. Some people say, really? If I don't know what my expected results are, how am I going to run the test? Hold on. I did not say that you do not know what the expected results are. I said you're not going to document them. And the only reason you're not going to document them is because you know them. And they're obvious and they're trivial and you don't want to waste time documenting it. So please understand, for the optional components here, they're optional documentation-wise. But they are optional because they're trivial and simple and I don't want to have time to spend time writing them. That's the Agile thing. That's how you test using Agile. So I could see that I have 25 different exploratory tests. Only for about 10 of them, I defined everything. For the other 15, I only put the test case number and the title. And the rest I know. Or the rest, I am sure the tester who's going to run them, he or she knows. So I don't need to waste the time. Now, if you work on a project where everyone says, no, we've got to document everything. I know I'm done with my time here, so I'm going to show you this slide about the exploratory tests based on scenarios. You simply, if you define scenarios, you can generate exploratory tests based on the scenarios. My sincere apology, this is a slide about, I'm going to walk you through it because when you get the recorded webinar, you can go, this is the different components of a formal test case. As you can see, it has much more stuff than the exploratory test case here. Okay? It has the test case number, test case title, it has the input, it has the preconditions, it has the post conditions, and this is not, as I said, this is not any different from what I teach in a non-Agile course. Okay? So when it comes to Agile test execution, I take the scenarios and start converting those scenarios to exploratory tests. Now, of course, the formal test cases, I'm going to have to execute them. If I wrote formal test cases, I wrote automated scripts, guess what? There's no difference in the way we run tests. So when it comes to really Agile test execution, it's not much different from non-Agile test execution, except when we take scenarios and convert them into tests using those three components. And the last slide here on Agile bug reporting. Again, Agile bug reporting is different in Agile in the sense that we don't write a lot in the bug report. We rely so much on recordings. I use this wonderful tool called the Jing. If you look at it, it's always here, right here. If you look at my screen, it's always at the top here. Why? Because I can simply, while I'm doing testing, I can do this and start recording my screen right there. So right now, my microphone is on, and I'm recording, and anything I test now on my screen is going to be in a recording that I can attach to my bug report. So my bug report would be a recording that has everything that I encountered when I was testing. Trust me, developers will appreciate that. My apology that I have taken 2 minutes beyond my time. Let me very quick here see if I have questions here. Oh, gee. All right, very quick. Few questions here. Isn't the best quality testing will be achieved if we do testing in detailed or not overlapping schedule? Because as what I observed, some of the companies, they always overlap. Yeah, you're right. You don't need to overlap in your testing, but to say the best quality testing to do is you can achieve is by doing detailed testing. Well, we know that, but in Agile projects we don't have detailed time to do a lot of detailed testing. That's why I walked you through the risk analysis model and how you choose certain test cases. I'm sorry, there's a question about what is the simplest explanation of use cases. I don't think I have a simple explanation. All what I tell you that it's a way to define the interactions between the system and the other actors around it. And within use cases, we develop scenarios, or what we call them use case scenarios, which includes things like preconditions, post-condition steps. Again, I have a full day. I have a full day on use cases, but also I have 1 hour webinars that I do, free webinars that I do on use cases. Ron says, in a mature Agile environment, do you think there is a role for a tester without any automation skills? Ron, I'm sorry to present the bad news to you. Very often, all Agile projects are going to realize that automation is critical, and they will have to get to give the time and allow the time to automate tests. Now, having said that, we need test automation engineers. This is a very important question, though. We need a test automation engineer to write the automation scripts. You don't have to be a test automation engineer. There is so much, as you can see in an Agile project. If you look at my process, there are so many other phases to it. So who's going to do the rest? If everyone is going to be test automation engineer, who's going to ask all those questions and get answers? Who's going to write the scenarios? Who's going to write the risk-based model and select the scenarios? Who's going to write the formal test cases or the exploratory test cases? You're going to do that, Ron. Okay, and only the people with automation skills are going to come down here. We have to realize that automated testing does not replace everything else. Even if it replaces manual testing 100%, even if an Agile project says 100% of our tests are automated, not everyone in the test team must have automation skills. So the bad news I was talking about is that you may not have, so in an Agile project where the Agile coach is not thinking carefully, he or she might think that Well, everything is done automated, so everyone has to become an automation engineer. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because we still need all these other analytical skills to write scenarios and verify scenarios and so on. All right. I'm sorry, Eric. I know I've taken beyond my time here. I'm going to stop here.
No.
Right, Eric?
Thank
Thanks,
you, Dr.
everyone.
Hanna.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to find out more about IIST news and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.